This is Ryan Cook from Moody Theological Seminary, and in this video I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the question, why study Hebrew? You're about to embark on Hebrew Grammar 2, and at this point you may be wondering a couple of things. A couple of questions might be rattling around in your mind. One is, why do seminaries require Hebrew? And the other is, what are some of the benefits? And the reason you might be asking yourself this is because learning Hebrew is difficult, as you well know by this point in your seminary career. Languages are complex, and learning to be able to work competently in them, to gain a reading proficiency in it, requires an enormous amount of time and energy to be able to get to that point. And you may be wondering in the midst of it, is it really worth it? Is there a payoff that makes it worth the investment of my time and energy and even emotional energy and things like that in learning a language? And I just want to say that you're not the first one to have wrestled with that question. If you go back to the early church, there were very few early church fathers that knew Hebrew. The church very quickly became predominantly Gentile, and they did not have the skill to, or the knowledge base or the tradition of learning Hebrew. One of the few that did take the time to learn Hebrew was the early church father Jerome. And Jerome translated famously the Old Testament into the Latin language called the Latin Vulgate, which became the Bible of the Western Christian church for over 1,000 years. And you got to think for a minute about how hard it was for Jerome to learn Hebrew. He couldn't just pick up a grammar or take a class at a seminary to learn Hebrew. There was no Hebrew grammar. There was no Hebrew lexicon. The way he had to learn it is to sit down with someone who knew it and go line by line from Greek to Hebrew, go into the Greek Septuagint, and just kind of back and forth, or from Hebrew into Latin, word by word, and just slowly pick it up that way. Jerome was also a prolific letter writer, and he wrote a friend of his about where he described the process of what it was like for him to learn Hebrew. And I thought this might be an encouragement to you. He said this: "When I was a young man and the deserted haunts of the wilderness imprisoned me, I committed myself to a certain brother to teach me Hebrew. So I learned the alphabet all over again and mulled over words that were both harsh sounding and guttural. What effort I expended on this! What hardship I went through! How often I lost all hope, and how often I threw up my hands in the air and then went back to it out of an eagerness to learn. I who suffered through all this, and those who lived with me can attest to what I say. I give thanks to the Lord that from this bitter seed of learning, I now pick sweet fruits." I don't know if you can resonate with the first half of what he said there, but I think that expresses well the feeling that a lot of Hebrew students have had over the millennia. What effort I put into this, how often I lost all hope, how difficult it was. And perhaps the people who live with you know how difficult it's been for you as well. But I do hope that you come to the point that he did at the end of that letter, where he said, from this bitter seed of learning, and I hope it's not too bitter, that you do learn to pick sweet fruits, that you do see the value, the payoff of it at the end of the day. And toward that end, I want to talk about some of the reasons to learn biblical Hebrew. So one reason, and there's a lot in this reason, is that learning biblical Hebrew adds accuracy, depth, and vividness to the study and teaching of the Old Testament. What do I mean by that? Let me take each of those words for a minute. What do I mean by accuracy? There's an Italian proverb, traduttore traditore, which translated means translator, traitor. Now, it's kind of ironic to be translating that, but the point that the proverb makes is that you can never fully translate the meaning and connotation of a work from one language into another without losing something. Any of you who are bilingual, who know maybe Spanish and English or another language in English, know just you can communicate through translation. It's not like you can't communicate, but that there's something lost when you do. The full connotation of the original utterance doesn't come through in exactly the same way. And so by learning Hebrew, you're able to engage directly with the biblical text, and you don't have that extra filter of having to come through and depend on a translation for that. It also adds depth to Hebrew. Languages are cultural artifacts, and a lot of the cultural values, the way that they approach the world is embedded within the language. And the only way to really know that is to learn the language. And then finally, there are many parts of the language that are difficult to, or if not impossible to translate, that make it more vivid. For example, word plays, sound effects, repetitions, especially things in more crafted works like poetry, where you can really get something in the original language that the meaning translates, but some of that vividness is hard to bring over into another language. Let me just give some examples of each of these. Imagine with me, if you will, you decided to write a Old Testament theology of prayer. Now, there are a lot of ways of going about a task like that. It would be a really valuable study. One way you could do it, I'm not saying this is the best way, but one way you could do it is to say, you know what, I'm going to look up in the Bible all the places in the Old Testament where it mentions the word prayer, and I'm going to study those passages. It's a pretty straightforward, approach. Now, let's say you did that. If you use the ESV translation, you'll find a whole list of passages that mention prayer. One of the things that you won't be able to tell, though, is that the ESV actually translates in English the word prayer 5 different Hebrew words. I'm not going to take the time to go through each of these, but each of these different words that are translated as prayer in the ESV have a slightly different nuance as to what type of prayer, what's the emotional tone of the prayer. It has a different nuance with each of them. And so engaging with the original languages allows you to be more accurate in terms of understanding what are these different nuances of prayer that are embedded in the language. Secondly, let's talk a little bit about how Hebrew helps you, knowing the Hebrew language helps you enter into that cultural mindset better. If I give you a map, right, you're going to orient it probably to the north, right? You'll put the north up, you'll put the south down, the east is to the right, the west is to the left. There's an interesting or a curious thing with Hebrew vocabulary. The word for left, which is samol, is also translated and is the word for north. And the word for right, yamin, is also the word for south. And if you just learn those vocab glosses, you might wonder, well, why is that? Why is left north and right south? And the answer to that is because in ancient Israel, they were an Eastern-oriented people. If they had a map of Israel, they would put the east up. And imagine you take that map and turn the east up. What's going to be to your left? The north, right? And what's to your right? The south. So their whole way of approaching the world assumes an eastward-facing direction. That's one of those things about the Hebrew mindset that the language just embeds for us that we might have a hard time really fully understanding without that. Interestingly enough, you might wonder, well, what's the word for west? There's a couple of different words for west. One is like the back of the neck, which would be like behind you if you're facing east. But probably the most common word for west in the Hebrew Bible is the word yam, or sea. And the reason for that, of course, is as you look at the map, what's to the west if you're in Israel? It's the Mediterranean Sea. And so their geographical locatedness is just embedded within the meaning of the language there. And that's something that is available to you as you learn the Hebrew language. And then third, vividness. There are so many word plays and sound effects in Hebrew that, especially in poetry, but in prophetic material, as well as in narrative, that are hard to, if not impossible, to fully translate into English. I'm not going to look at Psalm 103, 10-14 now. It's a great example, though, of a Hebrew writer using the letter kaf to start several different clauses in a row, so you get that sound repetition happening there. In Psalm 22, a really famous verse from the Psalter, this is what it is in Hebrew. I'm going to go ahead and read the Hebrew, and then we'll look at the English translation. The Hebrew here says, Eli, Eli, lama azabtani, rachok meshuati, divrei sha'agati. Now, if you count the number of words there in Hebrew, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? 8 words in Hebrew. Take a look at the English translation there. I put the NIV, the NIV is representative of most English translations. They're very similar. there's actually something like 22 words in the English translation. Now, you already know some of the reasons for that, right? Hebrew uses pronoun suffixes and things like that that English doesn't have. But it's even more than that here. The words that are in red in that translation are actually not represented in the Hebrew at all. They're additions that the translators put in to make it more understandable or comprehensive in English. And I understand the desire to do that. When you're translating for English readers, you want them to be able to understand what's being said. The challenge with that, though, is the tone. There's a tone there that's lost, where this is a deep lament, right? David is lamenting. And as he laments, his speech becomes much more elliptical and shortened to the point where when you get to the end of that second line there, he's not even saying a full sentence. And let me just translate it very literally in Hebrew. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my salvation, the words of my groaning. By the time you get to that end, it's not even a complete thought in that phrase. And it represents the kind of disordered mind that David has. It verbally represents the lament well. And that's something that you can catch in the Hebrew that's just a little bit harder to in English translation. Again, the meaning is the same, but it's the tone and the emotional register that's a little bit different there. So to summarize this first reason, reading the Bible through a translation is kind of like watching a black and white show on TV when HD color is available. So I actually like this analogy because if you watch a show in black and white, you can understand the show. You get it. The meaning is communicated clearly and faithfully in that way. Just like an English translation is very good. You can understand the meaning. It's communicated faithfully through translation. But watching something in HD color, it's more accurate. It's more vivid. You can see more of what's there. That's kind of a good way of thinking about the value of Hebrew. Another reason to study Hebrew is that it really aids New Testament study. The New Testament writers on just about every line of the New Testament are either quoting to, alluding to, or depending on a concept from the Old Testament. Martin Luther put it this way in one of his table talks to young pastors. He said, "The Hebrew language is the best language of all, with the richest vocabulary. No one can really understand the scriptures without it. For although the New Testament is written in Greek, it is full of Hebraisms and Hebrew expressions. It has therefore been aptly said that the Hebrews drink from the spring, and the Greeks from the stream that flows from it, and the Latins," and of course he's writing in Latin there, "from a downstream pool." So the Old Testament does provide us with the background, quotations, allusions, prophecies, types, proper names, loan words, figures of speech, idioms in the New Testament that are all connected to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, we have to remember, was the Bible of the earliest church. And there are so many examples, it's almost worth not even citing any, but daily bread, of course, in Matthew 6:11 brings to mind Exodus 16:4 and the daily manna that Israel went out to collect. That's one of just hundreds and hundreds of examples from the Old Testament. And then third, knowing biblical Hebrew allows you to engage in significant theological discussion on just about any theological topic. If there's a debate, for those who hold to the authority of Scripture, the debate comes down to what is the meaning of the biblical text in its original languages. And if you have access to that, you're able to have a seat at the table to engage in significant theological discussion and dialogue with others in the scholarly world much more effectively. And even if you're not dialoguing in the scholarly world on it, you'll be much more equipped to read and understand and engage yourself in those conversations. And that's an incredibly valuable thing that learning Hebrew can help provide for you. So this semester, it's worth the time to buckle down and to put the effort and energy into learning the Hebrew language well, and it will aid you for a lifetime of faithful ministry and study of the Word.